Okay. Hey, okay. Wait, should I get more centered?
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome to Legacy Owners Live, everyone. I'm Mike
Hey.
Glover.
And I'm Kale. It's
Hi,
been
Kale.
a while since I've done this.
I know. We just barely started it up and Kale is finally available. So
Yay.
we're
Happy to be back.
All right. Well,
This is fun.
let's go ahead and get into it. So Legacy Owners Live is live every week. We are in a temporary setup right now. You can kind of see the lighting is probably not that great, but we're under renovation.
Which is exciting.
Which is exciting because we have a full studio that's going to be ready for us here in the next couple months. And so it's going to be great. So
we're a lot of construction on the building, which is very exciting. That's it. It's going to be really pretty.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So on our Instagram, we'll be posting pictures and stuff like that on Legacy's Instagram. It'll be pretty cool. So follow us there on Instagram. LegacyGlobal.org is the handle for that. So we go live every week and discuss charitable strategies, donor advice funds, split interest gifts, complicated gifting, things like that. And we bring this to you guys live every week. And if you'd like to register and join the community, you can actually go to legacyownerslive.com. And we actually have a separate group that people can join and they can ask questions from other charitable fund leaders. So people who have advisory rights for donor advised funds or council members within the fiscal sponsorships that Legacy offers as well. Fundraising questions, compliance questions, 501c3 questions, all that kind of stuff. It's all pretty much, we're trying to build a community of people where they can ask those questions and we're in there to answer those questions for you. So it's going to be great.
It's a really good group.
Yeah. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about donor advised funds, part 2, because last week we did a little bit about high-level donor advised funds. Sometimes you'll hear us refer to it as a DAF. Okay, just because it's donor advised funds, obviously, right?
Yeah.
So we'll be talking a little bit about that. So, Kale, what are donor advised funds?
Well, donor advised funds are really good. It's a really good vehicle to give to charities. So if you are interested in giving to charitable organizations, this is a good vehicle to do so. Mike has already said this before in previous lives that a DAF is like a bank account pretty much for charities. And so if ever you want to give whatever money you want to charity, you can use a DAF to do so. And that's how we take care of it.
Yeah. And there's a lot of different reasons why you'd want to go through a donor advised fund rather than just going to the end user charity, right? It really simplifies giving, where if I'm giving to my local church, but I'm also giving to a local charity at the end of the year, I'm going to want to put those on my tax returns, right? I'm going to want to make my tax deductions, collect all those receipts and put those all in. With a donor advised fund, I can just give it all to one account with a local charity, right? And we can name it our own thing if we want it to be more of a legacy giving program, right? So sometimes we call them legacy funds, donor advised funds, but it could be like my donor advised fund is the Glover Foundation, right? And we use that as well as our fiscal sponsorship Glover Charities to train our kids about giving and all that kind of stuff. But we all just give through our donor advised funds, and then we can give to our church. We can advise on giving to another charity, things like that. But at the end of the year, when I go to file my taxes, I have one big receipt, pretty much, right? One statement. This is what you gave to the Glover Foundation, and this is what my tax write-off is, right? So it can really simplify the giving that way, rather than especially if you're a really big giver and you give to a lot of different causes, it can really streamline things a lot easier for you.
Yeah.
So,
and it's also nice to have a DAF and to work with us because when you're looking for charities to donate to, we make sure that charity is legit as well, so that your money is actually going to an actual organization and it can align with your charitable mission for your DAF as well.
That's right.
There's a lot that goes into it. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's perfectly fine. Yeah, there's a lot of things that you want to be aware of when giving to an organization, right? Are they legitimate? Do they have they might issue you a receipt and they say that it's tax deductible, but is it actually a qualified organization that is tax exempt? So giving through a charity that runs the donor advised fund, but then also knows what to look for, especially in charitable giving. There's a lot of fraud in charitable giving, right? There's a lot of people who act like they're a charity. There's even organizations that hold charitable contributions, right? We saw that last year. There's a lot of political things kind of going on and people giving to these causes, but then these platforms will hold funds because they don't necessarily agree with if it's really a charitable organization, even though they have their tax exempt status, they have all the legal paperwork in place and things like that. It can be a little difficult, especially if you're not used to the charitable space and you're not used to doing the vetting and the due diligence that's required for that. You want to make sure that that's all legitimately in place.
And it's good to have a DAF because you can kind of specify what your charitable mission is for your DAF. What are you wanting? What's your charitable purpose that you want to contribute to? And so having a DAF can establish that. We can help it make it your funds go to a legit charity. There's a lot. Right.
So as far as, and I've explained this on previous lives before, like what you were saying, Kale, is, opening up a bank account with a donor, like a donor advised fund, opening like a bank account with a bank, right? We set a specific charitable mission. And so the Glover Foundation has a specific charitable mission, building families and strengthening communities, right? But as I grow and I die, right, I can pass those advisory privileges over to my kids or over to the charity to make sure that donor advised fund keeps going and endures a lasting legacy, right? So when my kids take over that donor advised fund, they can't change the charitable mission, right? So if me and my sons, we disagree on what we give to charity, he can either advise that all those funds get granted out right away and then my cause is done and over with, or he can set up his own separate donor advised fund for a cause that he cares about, which eventually he'll probably do because we want him and his spouse to have some kind of charitable mission as well.
So that is good to know though. So once it's set up, like you were saying, the charitable mission, that cannot be changed.
Once the original donors pass away, legacy does not change that charitable mission.
Okay, no matter what.
Right.
But as long as you're living, it can be changed.
Right. We can.
Okay.
And you don't want to change it too often.
Okay.
And so there's that's why normally when we set up donor advised funds, we try to make them a broad spectrum of things, right? Because I don't want to pigeonhole myself to only give to foster care communities if I'm also wanting to give to battered women communities or charities later down the line.
So can you say your charitable mission one more time for your DAF?
Is to strengthen families and communities.
Okay, yeah.
Right. So there's a lot of different ways and a lot of different charities that can fulfill that. Right. And a lot of people go off of the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Right. So it's quality healthcare, I think, is one. Quality education is one. Equality is another. So we cover the Glover Foundation pretty much covers all of those, except for maybe life underwater and life on land. Right. We might not cover that, but we have a separate charity, a separate fiscal sponsorship for stuff like that also. So just because we have one donor advised fund for this, we can't, limit ourselves, and we can have a separate donor advised fund or a separate fiscal sponsorship or something like that covers what we want. So that's just kind of the benefit of knowing a lot about charitable giving.
Yeah. I've said this before, but I just want to say it again. I love that you do it with your family.
Oh, thanks.
That your kids get involved. I love that.
Yeah. Sometimes it's a little work to get them to be excited about it.
Yeah.
But I think that's just my kids in general. I have a son who really struggles with doing new things, but then when he does them and he has a lot of fun doing them, he feels good about it and he wants to do more. Right. It's like when we started doing piano, he hated piano for like the first 3 months. Yeah. But then all of a sudden he played his first song, Yankee Doodle. And now
that's so exciting for a kid.
That's so exciting. And now he can't get off that stupid thing. And so that's a catch-22, a little double-edged sword there. So
yeah, well, at least he's starting to like it now.
Yeah. So that's good. So now what kind of things can we give to a donor advised fund? Okay. Cash obviously is easy, right? That's an easy asset to give. We can transfer funds. We can use debit cards and checks and things like that to write to the donor advised fund. But cash only gives up about 10% of total given assets a year, right? So out of everything that's donated to a charity, to a donor advised fund, any kind of charitable organization, only 10% of that is cash. The rest of it is non-cash assets.
Which is crazy.
Yeah.
I wonder. Yeah, that's crazy.
You wonder what? What's the question?
Well, I was just going to say, I wonder if a lot of people realize that.
I think
I
people who are familiar with charitable giving realize that, but they don't. A lot of people who are just wanting to do charitable things, I don't think they realize what you can donate, because a lot of times they go to an attorney. An attorney might be specializing in patents or trademarks, and they're not going to know about charitable giving. You might go even to an estate planner, and they might know more about charitable giving, but they may not know everything about charitable giving, right? So you want to go to someone who understands charitable giving, what can be given, how does it go, because there is an order in which you can do things, especially for gifts like real estate. If you have a signed agreement anywhere down in writing, even on a napkin, that you're going to sell this real estate to this person, well, then there has to be some things that have to either be undone, or it could void the gift of real estate when you're giving to either a donor advised fund or a split interest gift. So giving, real estate, stock, private and publicly held securities can be donated there. Pretty much private equity, hedge fund interests, even cryptocurrencies. We've talked about cryptocurrencies a couple times on the live as well, especially when giving to split interest gifts, because you can get a partial deduction in lifetime income for that. And we can talk about more about that kind of fun stuff. But it really helps maximize those tax benefits, especially like if you're stuck in a 1031 exchange, for example, and you need some kind of charitable deduction because it's not going to be a like-in-kind transfer of real estate or things like that. Charitable giving can actually help get you out of that kind of cycle. So good. Any questions so far?
I don't think so.
No questions in the comments yet. So if you do have questions or comments within this topic, feel free to ask them in the chat. We can showcase them as well. So good. So what kind of things can a donor advised fund give to? Okay. So a donor advised fund can give to any IRS qualified public charity. Okay. So if you want to give to a public 501c3, a school, even, you can give to those kind of organizations. The things that donor advised funds cannot give to are things like private foundations. And private foundations are kind of not what they appear to be, in my opinion, just because when I hear private foundation, I'm thinking anonymity. I'm thinking, something I can have more control over, right? But private foundations have their own set of rules as well. And you publicly file that information. And so it's not really that private. So when you give when you're on the board, for example, of a private foundation, all that information is on that tax information, right? It's not as private or anonymous as you might think. A donor advised fund, though, is the exact opposite. Okay. So do you know a little bit more about that, about anonymity and donor advised funds?
Not as well as you do.
So a donor advised fund, me as a donor advisor, okay, I have advisory privileges for the account for Glover Foundation, right? And let's say I want to give to a family member's charity. Okay. So if they're working with Anasazi, for example, and I want to give to Anasazi, but I don't want my family member to know I'm giving to Anasazi. Okay. So because sometimes people are very private about their wealth, they don't want people knowing how much money that they have. And so if I'm going to give $600,000 to this charity, I don't want my family member knowing it came from me and knowing that I had $600,000 laying around. Right. So giving through a donor advised fund, I can choose, for example, Legacy Global, who is the donor advisor sponsor, right? I can have them, hey, I recommend, I have to use a recommendation language, right? I can't demand that the charity send that because I don't have those kind of privileges, right? I have advisory privileges. Hey, I can advise that we send $600,000 to the Anasazi Foundation, right? Because the Anasazi Foundation qualifies because they strengthen the community, right? They take wayward kids and they take them out to the wilderness, and they survive out in the wilderness for like a week. They lose like 20 pounds. They live off of lentils, and they eat dirt.
Wow.
Pretty much, you know. So then Legacy will do all the due diligence. They do all the vetting for the Anasazi Foundation, make sure that they are an IRS qualified public charity, which they are. Okay. So then they make out that grant, and I can choose whether or not that has the Glover Foundation's name on it, or if it has Legacy Global's name on it. And something that we do with our kids is right now they are fundraising in our fiscal sponsorship. They're fundraising $500 each, and they are going to choose out of all the money that they raise. It's a competition between the three of them, but out of all the money that they raise, they are going to be able to grant out that money. Okay.
Oh, wow.
And they're going to actually hand deliver the check to the charity that they choose. And then they have to work with that charity for a year. You can do something similar with a donor advised fund. You don't really fundraise with a donor advised fund. Okay. But you can still take a check, right? Our kids can still come to us and present what charity that they want to support. And, you know, they have to we do it as a leadership training, right? They have to do a presentation of why should we give this money to this charity?
That's awesome.
And then they go out and then they hand deliver the check, and then they actually have to work with that charity somehow for the next year. And then they have to return and report how that money was used, what impact.
Oh my gosh.
Right. So it's a good way to teach, especially legacy planning. We want our kids to be well-rounded adults, good gentlemen growing up, but we don't want them to think that, you know, have bad views about money. Money is a magnifier of what people already are, right? So if you are a good person and you get tons of money, you're going to do a lot of great things. But if you're a bad person with tons of money, you're going to do a lot of horrible things.
Mm-hmm.
And so doing it this way, we teach them the impact that money can have. And hopefully by the time that they're grown and their mind is set and they have their own personalities and things like that set in I don't know if it's set in stone. There's all those personality tests that say by the time they're 16, your traits are already set. I don't know all about all that, but I want to make sure by the time that they're 18, they have their resume stacked with volunteer service. They've given to charity. They've worked. They've learned how to present their cause, motivate and persuade people of why we should give and why we should do certain things. But then they've also seen the impact that it can do. We've seen it in a lot of different family offices where they're 9th, 10th generation. And this is what they do to help their kids prepare for an influx of wealth, right? So my wife and I, we're not wealthy, right? Monetarily, but we get older, we win the lottery, we have millions of dollars, right? The biggest concern for a lot of these wealthy families, especially in the ultra high net worth area, is that they're going to pass this money on and it's going to destroy their kids. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it literally destroys them because they might be drug addicts, or they go out and buy a fancy car and then they wrap it around a pole the next week and they're gone. Yeah. Right. So we've actually seen that case before, but being involved in philanthropic work from a young age helps set kids on the right path.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I love that. I'm always saying I love that. That's what you guys do as a family, because I think kids need to learn how to do that. I wasn't really learned in that way how to give. And so the fact that your kids get that experience at such a young age, it's really going to go far for them.
Oh yeah, I think so too.
But I did like that you said that that you could do grants anonymously if they wanted to,
right?
Or DAFs, like you could do that anonymously. That's good to know, because we are working with people right now who are doing that, and it's it's very important sometimes, just because sometimes you don't want people in your neighborhood to know. You know, you'd be surprised how many people in your neighborhood probably have a good amount of money, and they don't really necessarily want people to know it, because as soon as people know that they have money, what happens? They get hit up for money all the time, right? Mm-hmm. And people want to give, but there's limits all the time. Mm-hmm. Even Elon Musk, who is the richest man in the world, he has his limits on what he can't just give it all away and then be expected to keep giving and help all the people. There's always going to be more to give to, no matter how much money you have. Right. Yep.
Right. And so, excuse me. So giving that anonymously is also, it can be handy. And then sometimes it's not. Sometimes you want your name plastered all over the school. Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. Okay. So what are some other things you can't give to in a donor advised fund? So we talked about private foundations you can't give to. You can't give to individuals. Right. So I can't have my donor advised fund fund my son to go on a school trip.
Right.
right? But the donor advised fund can provide the entire classroom.
And
with a
so can you go into a little bit detail of why you're not able to go give to a specific individual?
Just because a lot of times that can be private endearment. You can probably give like a scholarship to an individual, but you have to have a certain arm's length away from that person, right? So I can't give to my son, but I can give to his whole class. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I just think that it's important to understand that when you are giving to like a scholarship, it's important to have like those guidelines. And that's why your mission is really important here, because you do not want to deviate. You can't deviate from your charitable mission.
Mm-hmm.
And so to give to an individual, I think, well, you can't do that. But if you were going to do like a scholarship, it has to be very detailed on what that money is going to, because we've seen sometimes where it's been given to a scholarship and they've kind of used and abused in some ways.
Yep.
And so you just want to really be careful with.
Yeah, usually there's a selection process that takes away that personal touch, kind of. So like there's an organization here in Arizona where like I mentor in the foster care system, but I'm not selecting who I'm mentoring. That's being selected by a separate nonprofit organization that I took a personality test. They have these foster kids taking a personality test and they match us together, right? So they have their own process to match us together. And even though our fiscal sponsorship is covering some of the costs that go along with that mentorship program, we're not the ones that selected the kids, right? So I can't go and select my nephews to be mentoring through this program and have Glover Charities or Glover Foundation cover it, because there is a direct relation to that, right? Unless they also were part of a bigger cohort that the program was doing that benefited a more general audience, right? So like giving to our kids' school program, right? Now I'm benefiting everyone in the class that my kid is a part of, right? So it's not just the one individual.
Right.
Good. All right. So how much does a donor advised fund cost?
To set one up?
Sure.
It doesn't cost anything.
Oh, yeah. That's great.
It's free.
It's free.
Yeah.
That's great. So a lot of times donor advised fund platforms do suggest having something in there, right? You do want to have I do believe you do want to have a little skin in the game, right? Putting something in there, especially if you're going to want to invest it. Donor advised funds can also be invested. That's another good point, is that if you have a significant amount to invest, then that money can grow over time, especially if you donate it, you invest into something like real estate that gives you a monthly contribution back into the donor advised fund. Now you're making contributions to other charities every month and not even touching the corpus or the principal of that investment, and it's still growing in perpetuity.
That's awesome.
So that would be really cool. But setting one up is great for free, because a lot of estate planners and estate planning attorneys will use the donor advised fund in the estate plan, just because if I'm going to set up a trust and I'm setting up an entire estate plan so that I have things planned for when I die. So I have a revocable trust, I have an irrevocable trust, and now I have a donor advised fund. If I'm going to want to change, for example, if I say when I die in my will, I'm going to say when I die, I want to give to X charity. Okay. And hopefully I live a long and prosperous life.
You will.
And I live till
all the Mountain Dew.
Yeah, the Mountain Dew is probably going to get me early, but it's good, so it's worth it.
It is worth it. I agree.
So, but who's to say that X charity is going to be around in 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, right? So now I pass away, my estate plan comes up, and it says, okay, the life insurance policy goes to the donor advised fund. I don't leave anything to my kids, because my kids are supposed to be responsible enough by the time they're adults. Let's hope everything goes to plan, God willing, right? So life insurance policy goes to the donor advised fund because I want to sponsor my legacy, right? But if I'm choosing X charity and X charity is no longer around, they no longer have their tax exempt status, now what? Now it makes things a lot more complicated. But if I have a donor advised fund set up, okay, and now I can still give to that cause, but now X charity is no longer there, right? Well, now my kids can advise a like charity that can go to that it can go to, that the funds can go to, right? So if I'm having my donor advised fund sponsor foster care programs, okay, and I'm giving to Aid for the Adoption of Special Kids, okay, it's an Arizona charity here, ask-az.org. They're no longer around in 50 years. Well, now my kids can find another charity, or even Legacy can find another charity that does the exact same thing that Aid for the Adoption of Special Kids used to do, and give to that charity instead, right? So it gives me a lot more flexibility. Not only does it simplify my tax reporting, but it also simplifies things after I die.
Yeah,
so,
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Very helpful.
Well, good. All right. Well, Kale, I don't have anything else. Do you have anything?
I don't.
All right. Well, we thank everyone for watching.
Yeah.
Be sure to head over to legacyownerslive.com, join our community, and ask your questions there. We'd be more than happy to answer those for you. Until next week, thanks, guys.
Bye.